Coming up next, we've got a talk on how to effectively translate literary stories into playable games. Have you ever wondered, how do you take media that was designed to be read from a book and translate that into best practices of creating a game? Well, this talk is going to cover exactly that, focusing on a case study of 2018 award winning book Stamped and how it was effectively translated into a game. So, without further ado, let's welcome our speakers.
Hi everyone, I'm Kavika,
And I'm Hannah.
and we are the main game makers for a visual novel game called Stamped, an Anti-Travel Game. And we are coming to you from UBC campus on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And I really want to thank the curators and hosts of the expo, and to acknowledge all the seen, unseen, and historical labor that has gone into creating this space and this time for us. Before we begin, I want to give a content summary that the talk will involve discussions of marginality, war, violence, and self-harm. So why don't we begin here? So this is the temporary title art for the game. It's called Stamped, an Anti-Travel Game, which was made by our chief artist. This art was made by our artist, a student at UBC named Bree. And as you can see, the game is about traveling and living in different parts of Asia and facing many of the hard truths that can come with travel. So the game tries to get at certain truths about the global economy, about histories, colonial histories, and contemporary forms of colonialism within the kind of travel sphere, as well as about our own inner demons and passions that lead us to travel and live abroad in the first place. Every character in the game and in the novel is marginalized in one way or in multiple ways. Racially marginalized, gendered, queer, marginalized by poverty, by accents, by nation, etc. And of course, all of them have become minorities or immigrants within the new spaces that they inhabit. They also each experience new forms of privilege abroad, which as minorities back home, they're often very unprepared to deal with, and this can have some pretty major and sometimes some funny consequences. So the game is a adaptation of two of my books. The character and plot and dialogue comes from Stamped, an Anti-Travel novel, which you see in the middle there, came out in 2018. While the game's main ideas and methods come from my second academic book called Open World Empire, on the bottom right there, Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games. As you can see here, I've written several books, two novels under my matrilineal name, Kavika Guillermo, and then two academic books under my patriarchal name, my legal name, Chris Patterson. And this is the first game I've made, which might be stunningly obvious to many of you as the talk goes on. I've never made a game before, though I've played games, and ever since I can remember, and I've written a lot about games and produced a book about games. And of course, as I've come to find, making and writing about games are entirely different things, but this is about us trying to do that. So to give a roadmap of the next 20 minutes, first I'll talk about the origins of the project, and then we will talk a bit about the adaptation process leading from the novel to the game. And then Hannah will discuss specifically some of her design decisions in programming the game. And then we'll end with some notes on the impact that we're hoping for the game to have and some theories about why we chose to do it this way that we've been doing it. So let me begin with the novel, Stamped, an Anti-Travel novel, how this started and how this kind of led to making a game about it. I began writing the novel back in 2006, and I had I think I must have been 21, 22, and I had a kind of mental, religious, sexual, and racial breakdown, like just everything kind of collapsing all at the same time. And so I gave away all my stuff. I took a single small backpack with just two pairs of clothes, and I just left. I didn't even have a car to my name, and I was technically like without a home, though I was more itinerant, is the way I kind of think about it, because I did have some money saved up, and more importantly, I had credit cards, so I could go into debt for 5 months or 6 months before getting really desperate. I hitched rides, I couch surfed, I cruised around the U.S. and Canada for about 5 months until I ran out of money. and decided to work as an English teacher in a small town in South Korea, a town called Gimhae, which is near Busan. From then on, I traveled and lived between Asia and the US until I received my PhD from the University of Washington and was able to live in China and Hong Kong, teaching there for 5 years. And so I live in Vancouver, Canada now. And during all this time, I wrote stories about myself and about friends I made while traveling, people who were really down and out, people who had many mental and physical health issues, people who had left their religions, their friends, their family, sometimes their own children. And eventually, I was able to package all these stories into a novel and publish it in 2018. And from the beginning, I just kind of, thought like I've written these stories, they should just be out there in case I meet someone and they want to like know about them. I don't have to tell the same stories over and over, so at least they'll be somewhere where they can just see it online. I just assumed that the novel would go relatively unnoticed. It had also been rejected by a lot of publishers. And then when I was able to get an agent for the book, they believed in the book, but they also realized within like a year that it was pretty unpublishable because so many people would reject it. The novel is very crass. It is very politically charged and very in your face in some of the lines and the politics. And it's very challenging, even when I reread it today. I realized it could have only been written by somebody who was going through the things that I was going through. And so it also has those kind of feelings in it that make it a bit challenging. And then in 2020, it won a somewhat big award, the Asian American Studies Association Book Award, which recognized the novel for what it could do in a classroom space and how it could affect young people in telling truths about colonialism, race, and community from the point of view of young travelers in their early 20s. So this gave me a lot more confidence in the book, and I was encouraged to try and make it more approachable to younger people, more teachable in classes. Instead of rewriting the book, which seemed like something I just didn't want to do, I'm also a scholar of video games, and so the clear way forward for me was to try and, if I wanted to broaden the audience of the novel, was to make it into a game. I also had no time or money to do that or ability to do that. And then COVID-19 came along, and suddenly everything shut down. And not only did I then have time to work on the game, but my university started offering these sizable grants to hire students to do any kind of work for you because students were getting more desperate during COVID as just maintaining life here. So I did get a grant to make the game, and then I found support from people in the community, in the game making community, from Analgesic Productions. Thank you, Melis and Marina. And then I set off to adapt the novel into a game. And that's, of course, when you suddenly realize just how much you're getting into and how over your head you're getting into. Just because I could write, a novel and I could write a book about video games did not mean I could make a game. I kind of knew that, but then I had to really understand that when I started to try. But several problems presented themselves. The first was that there's 3 different sections of the novel, and they're all very stylistically different. So, like, what did that mean to adapt these sections into a game when they're all entirely like about different things and different styles? So the first is like there's a first-person poetic blog about traveling. Then there are stories about travelers in certain cities, as you can see here. This is just the table of contents. And then there's a kind of WhatsApp style group messenger called Space Chat, where we can see the characters chatting and texting with each other, often hurling insults and slurs. And this takes place in 2007, 2008, right when the first iPhone came out. And so it's also like at that period when people just didn't really know what was an acceptable way to use this kind of media. But none of these sections seem to fit instantly into a game. And most of my ideas about how to adapt them were very impractical. I first imagined like 3D big worlds, things that I did not have that much grant money to do. But eventually, with the help from folks at UBC and at Analgesic Productions, we were able to come up with unique styles for each section. So I'll just go over them here. The first one we adapted was the space chat sections, and these are kind of the shortest sections in the novel. But these are the chat sections, the chat rooms. I won't read these out loud, but you can read them. And as you can see, they're pretty in your face and politically incorrect. But yet they're also very accurate for the kind of chat groups that I was in at this time, especially in these immigrant expatriate communities in Asia. It's just very, people are outside their usual communities, their usual families and friends. They feel a bit more like engaged and able to just say whatever comes to their mind. So that's what you get in these sections. And of course, people are often like drinking and things at the time too. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the best approach to try and adapt these sections was in a visual novel style. And I had never really written about visual novels, but I was a big fan of the genre. And I liked how there's certain archetypes or archetypical figures that come from the Japanese genres, but have been imported into indie games. And so I was very inspired here by like Doki Doki Literature Club, games by AVB, Christine Love, and probably my favorite game of all time, Butterfly Soup by Brianna Lay, and how they would reuse these archetypical figures and make them a bit more deep and interesting. And so I wanted to do that, but I wanted to use the kind of realness of these sections, the kind of in your face way they talk about race and colonialism and so on, and then use these archetypes as ways that players can then become part of it and understand where it's coming from. You can also see that sometimes there's like 4 or 5 characters on screen at a time, so it's a bit easier to keep track of where people are and who's talking, kind of like a play in some ways. So here the player can interact with all the different characters and also play as the other characters while drinking and living within this immigrant bar culture. So all of these sections take place in a bar called Beer and Girls, which sounds pretty dumb, and it is, but it's also the name of the bar that we always hung out at this small town in Korea. So it's based on a real bar, and similarly on some of the real people I knew there, as absurd as it can sound. It also really helped that the game engine for visual novels, Rinpai, is free and easier to use than most others, like say Unity. And so it gave us a practical way of actually making this thing happen. The next challenge was in adapting the blog sections. So as you can see here, they're written to look like web blogs. And these blog sections were actually from the travel blogs that I was keeping when I was traveling. And they're a bit like rearranged, but a lot of the language is the same. So to give you a sense, I'll just read the first one, which is also the very first page of the novel. So it says, think travel, blog book, post dates, user. Sky Farallon is the name of the main character. And then he says, the plan is to travel until the pain runs you over. But Bangkok was the worst place to start. It's just too easy here, in the land of smiles. Instead of a long, pathetic decay, you find food so cheap you couldn't possibly starve, people so beautiful you couldn't possibly be lonely, a police force strictly for foreigners, a hotel room for $7, cheap massages that taunt your hopes of perishing in a blaze of hardcore travel glory. And because you are as brown as the fried cricket snacks that tantalize every street stall, you get to stroll into historic temples through the locals only line. So the writing is a bit more poetic than in other parts of the novel, I think just because that's where my mind was when I was traveling. They're also very visual because I would literally write this right after, after I'd witnessed all of these things. And so I was basically just writing about things I was looking at and things I was smelling and seeing. So it has a lot of, feeling and touch attached to them. We had no idea at first what to do with these sections, but eventually we settled on the idea to use kind of poems and images together. So I broke these up into more poetic lines, as you can see here, and a bit more rhythmic. And then I used the real travel pictures that I took on these trips, some taken by me, and then my partner, Ideng Trung, also happened to travel to a lot of the same places I had traveled, even though we didn't know each other, and around the same time. And so we ended up using some of each other's photos for this. So we have the photos right next to these poetic lines that are also made interactive. They're kind of like twine, interactive fiction or interactive poetry with a branching narrative that then juxtaposes the lines with the photos. So you can see actually what's happening, what's being talked about as you're also reading about it now. By doing this, we wanted to capture the reflective, critical, and educational moments that can emerge when traveling alone, while also being aware of the history of a space through observing the way people react to the traveler who inhabits these spaces. So sometimes, you get a picture of a cat. Sometimes you just get very blurred pictures. Like these are very old cameras that I was using, very old. They're like 13, 14 years old. But by today's standards, they're quite blurry. And they were not iPhone images. And so you get that through these images. And sometimes we blurred them a bit more just to keep the faces blurred. So we didn't run into any issues there. The third section, oh, you can see a little bit more here. So you can turn left, turn right, and the pictures kind of topple on top of each other so that you can see more, and you get a kind of sense of collecting all these pictures too. Okay, and the chapters. So the third section that we adapted was probably the most difficult and still in progress, I should say. The chapters of the novel are by far the longest and the most important parts of the novel, and they're meant to break through the kind of surface and community level personages of the characters to focus on particular travel stories that reveal their faults, desires, and mistakes. So the chapters in the novel are again the main parts of the novel, but in we weren't really sure like where to put them or how to put them into the game. We also knew I didn't really want to emphasize the chapters as much. I wanted it to be so that if the player had read the book by some chance, had come across it, read the book, they could come to the video game and find something very different. I did a lot of there was a lot of new writing basically for the game. But the longer portions of the novel are now in the shortest portions of the game for that reason, and the most abstract portions. So we went for a series of point-and-click episodes that explore the backstory for each character. So you run into these when you're engaging with the character in conversation in the bar, and then they will sometimes reminisce on the past, and then this is the kind of flashback to those moments. You get to hear about where they've traveled, why they went to those spaces, and the kind of experiences they had there, and how their gendered, racialized, sexualized, nationalized body was read within those spaces, and the impact they might have had upon others in those spaces. We found an amazing artist, Maya Espiritu, whose hand-painted art on canvas gives the episodes a kind of dreamlike quality, and also reminds the players that we are within a memory being told by a very biased source, and someone who's perhaps inebriated and feeling vulnerable at the same time. So these spaces are also based on actual like photos and spaces that I had been to or continue to go back to. So the photo that you just saw, for example, on the left is from Bopara Center in Phnom Penh. And on the right, sometimes it's just a street where things might happen. So these scenes are based on these real places, and the episodes focus on the spaces through this kind of point and click genre. So it focuses on particular objects that reveal multiple layers of the travel stories. I'll leave it to our lead designer or lead programmer, Hannah, to give us a bit more details on the design decisions that we made in developing these sections.
Cool. Thanks, Kavika. So I'm just going to go over 4 different details of the game implementation. So to start, all of the text in the blog portions of the game have clickable text that advances the text by virtually turning the page. And pretty like standardly, the pointer changes to a hand when different types of text can be clicked. And so then while the text shows up on the screen, you can actually hear a paper writing sound as you're playing the game. So it kind of progresses you along as if you're actively writing it from the first person. And then there are also times when images from the story that's being told are overlaid on the pages as well, as you saw previously. And then so for most of the bar scenes and chapters, players will hear music kind of interspersed with pauses of animations and transitions and different pauses and like kind of long tangents from the characters. And these types of actions are kind of like inactions that require the player to kind of sit and watch and talk about their lives and putting the players in the observer role. So as you're standing there kind of listening to your friends talking, you're also feeling all of these different things with the music in the background, the people talking, all of that kind of stuff. And so then when there's like a multiple choice option that pops up as you're advancing through the game, the backend implementation has 1 or more correct answers, but the player isn't obviously aware of that, which can really depend on what the players select. So it can change what happens next in the game. In the episodes, this is when the playstyle switches to more of a point and click portion of the game. So players will see a different art style in the episodes indicating that change in mode, but all the clickable objects are not viewable to the player until they mouse over the objects. So searching for items that are unseen also make the game a bit more exploratory in this mode, and you have to do some scavenger hunting for objects. And you don't really know how many there are or what they will reveal for you. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the representative text in the game as well. So fonts in the game represent different mode changes, kind of similar to art style as well. So for example, when getting a text message on a phone, the font will help the players make the text more realized by their stylistic font. And the fonts are also indicative of a narration mode too. So blogs and episodes have the same font style, whereas other portions of the game are more experiential. So there are things like languages that you can't read.
Okay, so we wanted to conclude this last section by returning to the question in our title, can queerness slash marginalization translate? Or perhaps better way to put it is how can queerness slash marginalization translate? And we wanted to also keep in mind that we envision the audience of the game most foremost as young people, not necessarily students, but perhaps students, but young people who are racialized, queer, or otherwise precarious, yet who also want to have the capability to do things that traditionally are only available to higher classes, as in like traveling, discovering, and learning. And I think we're also envisioning the audience a bit as being like Asian Canadian, Asian American, Asian diasporic, or people in Asia as well. And so there's a bit of a centering of the audience, not just being a kind of generalized audience as well. But some of the impact that we were hoping to think about here. First, let's look at what you actually do in the game and the in-your-face content of the game itself. I keep using that term in your face, but let's just roll with it. Since I was young, I always longed for a game that kind of reflects my life in the way I sometimes saw in television, films, and literature. In the ways that some of those other genres will take on very heavy issues, and that's kind of expected, right? You pick up a novel and you expect very like heavy issues and sometimes a lot of sadness and grief and things like that. Not necessarily what we come to video games in the mood to do, right? But I thought it was important, and I wanted to have a way of representing issues like race, gender, class, and colonialism in the way that we, on a daily basis, kind of translate or engage with these things through the way that we talk to each other, sometimes just in laughter and parody and humor and in the decisions that we make. And so the game, like the novel, tries to approach these issues in the same way that I experienced them while living abroad, which means like head on and without much filter, right? And so many of the lines are written verbatim from conversations that I've had, text chats that I've been a part of, and my own private thoughts. And so here, this is a conversation. I'm going to continually use Arthur here because he's like the kind of typical white guy in the group, though he's very like not that, but that's how he appears. So it's easier to pick on him a bit. But he says here, you think you've got me all figured out, the whitey sexpat roaming Asia looking for the next score. Right? And this is actually how we all kind of talk to each other in these communities, right? And it was immediately about like being just kind of truthful and honest about issues of race and how colonialism affects us. And these are very loose communities where people come and go, right, quite often. And so I was often the only American or the only person of Filipino descent. And there was always a lot of alcohol flowing around. So this is going to sound weird, but I got to hear instantly what people thought of me and what they thought of other people, how I was read. And, rather than just seeing these things as racist, which, sometimes they were, I also saw it as a kind of rare opportunity of confronting the way most people actually think, but are too polite to actually say out loud. Right? And I think a lot of people who have traveled and been in these communities have known this and sometimes have witnessed it in violent ways. Right? But I didn't want to let up too much on that. I wanted the reader to be able to experience that, and then the player in these games. And I also wanted to express how many of us still find community in these spaces and still find self-worth within these moments and within these groups. So I try to use that throughout the game. The second thing that we try to do in this translation adaptation process is in the way that the players can interact with these difficult moments. And so I didn't want to just leave the player hanging as if they have to just absorb them and keep them there, right? So you hear like Arthur's story here in this scene. Arthur explains why he chose to leave his child with the child's mother in Nanjing, China, rather than trying to be a father. Then the player has to choose how they respond to the story, basically asking them to practice a type of deep reading to analyze and interpret, what's going on, not for a classroom or for a paper or something like that, but just for their own ethical stance, right? And so Arthur says, I know Vanessa, all she ever wanted was to be a mother. She screwed my life to do it. He's in good hands. The child is in good hands. So you can respond in either way. You can say, you're right, Joey doesn't deserve you. At least you're giving him a chance by walking away, right? So it's kind of like, yeah, you're a scumbag. You should stay away from him. You could also say that's some way to justify your negligence. Joey will always wonder who his father is. Or you can say, the completionist in me demands to know more. Why was your wife so unhappy with you? Did you hurt her? Was she afraid you'd be an abusive father? So you can also pry and try to figure out, is he hiding something? Which probably is. You can say, you really think growing up in China is better than the US? And so this is Arthur's view, that the child is better in China because he thinks the US is not great right now. Growing up very poor and having no healthcare. This is why he thinks that. So you can react in either of these ways. And the character will always also talk back. Sometimes they'll get defensive. Sometimes they'll accept their faults. Sometimes they will show you or prove to you how wrong you are and inaccurate you are. Sometimes they'll just simply need space, right? So in other words, we tried to make it so that there's risk in these decisions, even if it's not like a kind of traditional game risk of like, oh, you might die or something, or you might have to start over. There's a risk in making the wrong decision, or there's risk in getting reactions out of people that you might not be looking for. Okay. The last thing we were trying to think about a lot in adapting the game was to try and consider the ways that colonialism and racism also benefit the Western traveler. This is a big part of the novel, but I was hoping to have ways of doing this through the game and trying to simulate travel experiences and then showing the ways that travelers, even marginalized travelers, queer and marginalized folk can then have to negotiate and often end up abusing the privilege that they have abroad. I witnessed this a lot, people who had a very hard time in Canada or North America or the US, going to Asia and traveling around and not realizing they had privilege and power. And so being, unintentionally abusive to locals. And so I wanted to kind of give that to the player too. I wanted to, I think one of the things that inspire me about video games constantly is their ability to put you in positions of power, right? And to make you feel guilty for the way that you use that power. And so this is something we try to do throughout the game in all of the sections of the game. So you can see here on the left in the blog section, it says you tell her in a fake accent that your name is Nico. So you can make up a person, pretend that's who you are, right? In the upper right portion here, this is from one of the episodes where two of the characters are paid like $1,000 to show up to a ball and pretend that they work for a company. This is also something that happened a lot. They would often just take a white traveler, usually a white male traveler, and a company would pay them to pretend to work for the company so that the company looked a bit more cosmopolitan. And so these travelers do take advantage of these kind of things, the way that race is perceived. And then you also have characters like Sophia down below, just trying to dish out everyone's privilege, calling them out on things constantly. So for me, like that really hones in sometimes on some of the ways that games emphasize power and consequences of actions. And so Stamped attempts to do this throughout by making the violences of colonialism often traceable to the violences of tourism and the violences of the player themselves and the choices that they could make. Okay, so that's our presentation. We want to thank anyone who's been watching and to the organizers, and to please check out the current demo for the game, which is now up on itch.io, and to look out for the full game, which we're hoping should be up December, perhaps early 2023, I think is the more realistic date we're aiming for. If you'd like to support us or reach out to us, you can reach me on Twitter at Kavika Guillermo or Hannah at HMHRCHL. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for watching.
Bye.
Thank you all for that lovely talk. As for the audience, I hope y'all learned a lot of pro tips about evolving literary stories into games. If there's anything insightful that you think should be shared to the rest of the world, please go ahead, post it on the Twitters, post it on the Facebooks, drop our hashtag GDOC Expo, and share that knowledge.